Feel free to say hello to your neighbors. We're going to delay the start by just a few minutes tonight in honor of the sobriety checkpoint. So please be patient with us, but we do want to allow some people we're expecting to arrive.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. My name is Michelle Weiss-Little, sister of FDNY firefighter David Martin Weiss. Rescue 1, Midtown Manhattan, murdered on September 11th, 2001. His body never recovered. North Tower. The first tower hit, the second to fall. How painful it must have been for his fellow brothers who searched for days on end for lost souls whose dust would cover our rescuers' clothing, boots, skin, lungs, instead of living bodies. The nightmares, the agony. As a family member who has spoken out over these past 9 years, I am hopeful still that we, humanity, can come together, understand the depths of our connection, and wake up to the promise within each of us that there is love. And with love, we can push back the evil that men do. With the power of love, the power of the heart. Our survival hinges on our willingness to face the truth, to find our own courage, to open our hearts, to hold accountable, to be responsible, to forgive, and to love. David was my best friend. His legacy of brotherhood, unity, and humanitarian service carries through the children's voices, through an organization I created called Unite in Peace on September 16th, 2001. No matter who is responsible for the attacks of September 11th, my brother died caring for his fellow humans, and nothing takes that away. He was part of the elite unit Rescue 1. I call them the Navy SEALs of the public sector. David was a firefighter. He knew he'd be a firefighter all his life. and firefighters risk their lives every day for their brothers and sisters, for you, and for any of your family members. My brother would have gone into that building no matter who was in there, no matter who is responsible. He faced his fear and he did his duty. It is our turn to face our fears, to realize we all have duties, in addition to our rights, to face the truth of that day, be responsible, seek justice so that their sacrifice was not in vain. As a country, we promised we would never forget. They gave their life. At the very least, we can give our time and attention to demand a real investigation in bringing justice to our loved ones and to the world as it is today. We are all connected in this web we call life. If we're all connected, then we can say we're brothers and sisters. If we say that we're brothers and sisters, then I am your sister, and David is your brother. As a family member, I have questions. Do you? As family members, we all deserve truthful answers. That's why we're all here tonight. Like I tell my daughters, Corey and Sarah, this is the only moment we have. Make it the most precious moment we've got. Thank you.
I would just like to ask for a moment of silence for those who died on 9/11, innocent civilians, first responders, and those who continue to suffer because of their exposure to the rescue and other operations at the World Trade Center. For a moment, please. Our commitment to you tonight is to speak the truth and to leave you with extremely valuable science-based information. I believe you will come to an updated understanding about what is science and what is so-called conspiracy. But please, don't believe us. We're not looking for believers. This is not some kind of new religion. We implore you, check out every fact that you hear tonight, because it's extremely important that we know the whole truth about this event. After all, it served as the pretext for the invasion of two countries, in which over 1 million people have already perished, and the loss through legislation of many of our hard-won freedoms that we used to cherish here in the United States. To identify the perpetrator, first, know the crime. Tonight we focus on the forensic evidence found and destroyed at the crime scene, the eyewitness testimony, and the official government reports. I'm Peter B. Collins. I'm a radio talk show host. I appreciate that. I currently host a podcast, and there's some little business cards out at the tables if you'd care to pick one up and listen at your convenience. PeterBCollins.com is my website, and the podcasts are also available at iTunes. Now, I'm one of the few people in the media, not just locally, but across the whole country, who's willing to honestly acknowledge my skepticism about the official story of 9/11. And I pay a price for it. Whenever I discuss it, I get a round of emails. Most of the people are thrilled that someone is giving voice to the suspicions, the questions, and the contradictions that they're processing. I can't say it's a career booster. Now, I was not in the country on 9/11. I was in Barcelona, Spain. And it was a little strange to be away from home and disconnected from these cataclysmic events. And we'd been out for dinner, had a nice bottle of Spanish champagne, the Cava. And when we got back to the room, we flipped the TV on, and like so many people, we'll never forget what we saw. The only American network that was on my TV channel in the hotel was CNBC. And they were interrupting the market coverage for updates on the events in New York, later in Washington. And their whole perspective was about money, which seemed strange at that moment. But we flipped around, and there was German television, RTL from France, and the Italian network, and state television from Spain. And I later reviewed videotapes that a friend had made of the American coverage. And in the U.S. media, immediately, they went to Al-Qaeda as the one and only suspect. But on European television, it was very different. They included Al-Qaeda as a suspect, but they offered a range of other terrorist groups and possibilities of another Timothy McVeigh. And I'll return to the European perspective in a moment. But it really opened my eyes because they offer more context in the media. And we saw pictures of the Bill Clinton move to send cruise missiles during the Lewinsky scandal at the pharmaceutical plant in Sudan. We saw pictures of the coal. But also we saw Hezbollah, and we saw some other European-based terrorist groups. And the rush to judgment in the American media is one of the reasons that I was initially suspicious of the official story. So, I'm still seeking the truth. I believe we need a new investigation, an impartial one, perhaps one conducted by another nation. It shouldn't be in New York or Washington. It shouldn't include Lee Hamilton. And it has to have full investigative powers, subpoena power, and full independence. Because otherwise we will live with the darkness and the lurking suspicion about what occurred on 9/11. And tonight, you're going to see information, evidence, physical evidence, and scientific proof that should be available to you in the mainstream media. It's now my great pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speakers. These professionals have been willing to place their credibility and reputations on the line. Will you please give a warm welcome to Mr. Richard Gage, AIA. Welcome the courageous Eric Warren, firefighters for 9/11 Truth. Myth number one, 9/11 is in the past. Let it rest.
I was deeply moved by what happened, and I didn't want to look at this. I couldn't look at it. It was just too emotional. And I'd actually get angry when people were telling me, what had happened. I didn't want to hear it. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I really decided I needed to look at it again. And once I did, I just couldn't stop because it's such a huge part of our world today. And what I learned through my research is I'm not the only one out there. They're actually the investigators themselves that question what happened. That's what we're going to get into. So the 9/11 commissioners themselves, a lot of people in this country feel that this has been put to rest, that the investigation has been done, that everybody believes in it, that there's no whistleblowers out there, that there's no, the evidence has all been debunked, and it's not true. These are the 9/11 commissioners themselves, and here you're going to see for a second what they say about their own investigation.
So there are all kinds of reasons we thought we were set up to fail. We got started late. We had a very short time frame. Indeed, we had to get it extended. We did not have enough money. They were afraid we were going to hang somebody, that we would point the finger.
Lee and I write in our book that we think the commission in many ways was set up to fail because we had not enough money. We didn't have enough time. We'd been appointed by the most partisan people in Washington
So even the commissioners themselves don't believe it. And the other thing that I found once I started looking, which was really shocking to me, is the FBI were the lead investigators, the 9/11 investigation. They were the criminal investigators. They themselves don't publicly accuse them. This is what they say: murder U.S. nationals outside the United States, conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals outside the United States, attack on a federal facility resulting in death. And then they say Osama bin Laden is wanted in connection with the August 7th, 1998 bombings of the United States embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. These attacks killed over 200 people. In addition, bin Laden is a suspect in other terrorist attacks throughout the world. Not once is it mentioned 9/11 that he's a suspect there. So even the FBI doubts his responsibility.
Is 9/11 behind us? Well, let's look at Time magazine, who cited in a poll in 2006, a Scripps Howard poll, that 36% of Americans want a new investigation. Time reports that this is not a fringe phenomenon, the 9/11 truth movement, but a mainstream political reality of greater disturbance. A poll in 2007 by Scripps Howard, Ohio University, cites that 16% of Americans believe that the World Trade Center Twin Towers were brought down by explosive controlled demolition. NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, tasked with explaining these collapses, cites that they found no evidence for explosive controlled demolition. Later, they acknowledged that they never looked for it. How can you find what you're not looking for? Well, thousands of architects, engineers, scientists over the last 9 years have been looking for it, and it wasn't hard to find. We've been speaking about it in over 30 American cities and across 16 countries, 150 times now altogether. And these have put their licenses, their degrees, their credibility on the line, calling for a new investigation as a result of the evidence that you're going to be seeing tonight that we've not seen in the mainstream media, we've not heard from our government, and not in the official building assessment reports.
All right, so we're going to pick up the speed here now, and we're just going to give you a little foundation. Because we're using the term NIST, Richard just went over that, and NFPA. And for those of you who aren't firefighters, the NFPA is the National Fire Protection Association. And they're basically tasked with setting our national standards and their more guidelines, their suggestions to cities. So they cover everything. How many firefighters we send into a building before, how many firefighters we have to have outside before we can send firefighters in. They cover also investigation standards. So they're the ones. It's the manual. What NFPA has, they've written several manuals, but this is what's called the NFPA 921. It's the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations. And when I first started looking into 9/11. I wanted to see what were the standards that they should have followed. And as you see here, this became the national standard on, I think it was September, well, it actually was in August, so 2001. So it was the national standard right before 2011, or 2001, sorry. And the NFPA 921 will cover the way the investigation should have happened. And I'm just going to let it go at that. We're going to continue on, and I'll get my head back here in just a second.
There are many forces that destroy buildings. When we try to figure out what happened to the Twin Towers, we do background research. Of course, fire is one of the forces. We have controlled demolition. Behaves very differently than fire. And we have other forces such as earthquakes and controlled demolitions and explosions. Let's start with fires first. Fires is an organic process. It moves through the building every 20 minutes or so, leaving an area burned out as it's looking for fresh, new fuel sources. So when a building collapses due to fire, we have large, gradual deformations. It's not a sudden collapse, and it's not straight down through the path of greatest resistance. If the building falls over, well, this has never happened in high-rises. In fact, we have over 100 examples of high-rises that you'll see that these buildings have never collapsed due to fire for a number of reasons, which we'll get into. But say in wood frame buildings, large gradual deformations, the building falls over. Like these, a natural organic collapse, they fall asymmetrically because we have asymmetrical damage. It falls towards the path of least resistance. The structure is inherent. It doesn't dismember the structural elements from each other. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. These buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous clouds of pyroclastic-like flow, where the solids of these pulverized building materials are suspended in the air, with incredible gases fueling them due to the incredibly hot temperatures from the explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. So if we have these characteristic features, we know we have explosions. These are explosive controlled demolitions. They can be engineered in a number of different ways. Normally the purpose is to bring down a building efficiently and avoiding damage to other buildings. So what we do is place explosives throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonate them in a very precise order, beginning with the inside and working our way out, and synchronistically timed floor by floor. So what we have as a result is a set of very important, identifiable, key characteristics. And what those are is a free fall, almost, collapse of the structure into a small pile that's broken up, ready for loading and shipment. We have these thick gases. We have a number of explosions that go off that we can see at different floors, of course. We'll get into more of those in a moment.
The next myth, we can trust our government officials in investigations.
So what I was going to say about the NFPA and the investigation manual, those are guidelines. Now they're not set, you don't have to follow those exactly. They're not laws, they're not mandates, they're guidelines. And the reason why they were created was for small departments that didn't have big city fire investigation units. And they wanted to give them a guideline, like what are the basics you should do? So the big city and the federal government, they can stray from these, but typically when they stray, they over-stray. I mean, they over-investigate. They don't go below those standards. And it's just like any big city fire department. For the most part, we follow the standards or we exceed them, depending on our funding. But those investigators usually go way beyond them. So what we're going to get into is where they fell short on almost every single one of them. And so that we can trust our government and officials and investigations. The reason why I want to bring up this guy is it's not related to 9/11. His name's John Ward, and he was a convicted serial arsonist. He was a fire captain and arson investigator for the Glendale Fire Department. He was in charge of LA's investigation unit. He was a very well-respected investigator. They called him when they couldn't figure out, people from all over Southern California called him when they couldn't figure out fires. And, nobody knows a fire like an arsonist. And so they made a movie about him, and he's had multiple life sentences. He actually was the biggest arsonist in Southern California. So here's one of the top investigators. I think we as people, especially in our country, where we've dropped the ball is we're trusting everybody too much. We're trusting these officials where everybody's human, so they can all make mistakes. So that's the big thing, is we're here, and obviously from the hands that we're up, you guys believe the same way we do, but we can't trust us, and what we're saying too is don't believe us. Don't, Richard and I either. Verify everything we're telling you. Do your own research.
Next myth, the scientific method was used in the investigation.
And the scientific method is mentioned in NFPA 921. It says that's the entire reason that manual was created, to have a systematic approach. And so it's basically you find the problem, you collect the data, you analyze the data, you develop a hypothesis, then you test that hypothesis, and then you go back. If that doesn't work, it doesn't match your hypothesis, you go back. So basic methodology, NFPA 921 2.1 covers this very well. It gets into the basic methodology of a fire investigation. A fire explosion investigation is a complex endeavor involving skill, technology, blah, blah, blah. You go down, the use of a systematic approach often will uncover new factual data for analysis which may require previous conclusions to be reevaluated. Federal evidence rules. This is a big one. There's types of evidence. There are basically 3 types of evidence, all of which in some manner relate to fire investigations. They are demonstrative, documentary evidence, and testimonial evidence. And that's what we're going to be showing you tonight.
Sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure, a straight-down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint, because demolition waves remove those column supports. This results in a free-fall acceleration as fast as a bowling ball drops off the side of the building. Then we have total dismemberment of the steel structure for shipment, and we have minimal damage to adjacent structures, of course. Witnesses hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. There's enormous clouds of pulverized concrete. and these squibs, or explosive isolated ejections out of the sides of the buildings at various levels. And of course, there's chemical evidence of cutter charges. Now, this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. And guess what? Fire can't account for any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. If we have additional supporting documentation, like the government documentation, experts agree, that's a controlled demolition. Foreknowledge, because these are planned months in advance, of course, video documentation, this is all proof of controlled demolition.
Myth. There were only 2 towers destroyed on 9/11.
World Trade Center Building 7. Worst structural failure in modern history that most Americans know nothing about, and most architects and engineers. This was a 47-story skyscraper across about a football field in length away from the North Tower. It would be the highest building in most of our states, in fact. Now, this building wasn't hit by an airplane, so it doesn't have that range of reasons or causes for its coming down. Now, this building was an extremely unusual skyscraper. It was built over an existing building, a Con Edison electrical substation. So it had massive trusses spanning across that substation with huge columns. So now, this building was brought down by fire, according to official sources. If we had fires that would have brought down one of these columns, it was so extremely likely, it would be all the more reason that this building would fall over, right, if one of those columns or one of those massive trusses heated up. Now, here's our Building 7. During the collapse of the North Tower, it stood fine. It received some damage, some pelting with some of the beams, and it actually caught fire from about 1 o'clock to about 4 o'clock. There are some fires in this building. I'll show you those, but you can see the building still standing after the collapse of this North Tower. Now, let's take a look at the collapse of Building 7 on the left, and we'll compare it to the collapse of a known controlled demolition on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant a new investigation into the possible use of explosives? And yet the a priori concept or hypothesis on the part of the investigators was, we're going to prove how this building came down by fire. Even though, as you'll see, there are witnesses of explosions. There is evidence that it behaved exactly like every other high-rise that collapsed before, which all collapsed due to controlled demolition. Let's take one more look.
Myth. Experts agree with the government reports.
Well, here's Danny Jawenko, who has a problem with the official report. What does he say? He's a top European controlled demolitions expert, and he has over 20 years in explosive controlled demolition. He says it starts from below. They're simply blowing away the columns. It's a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. And Kamal Obey, one of our 40 structural engineers, and we'll be hearing from one of our structural engineers shortly. But he says a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building.
Myth. World Trade Center Building 7 was fully engulfed in fire.
Well, these are the fires that are blamed for the cause of the destruction of this building. In fact, we have isolated pockets of fire, as you can see, on the 12th floor, particularly where the cause, the start, the initiation